A conversation with Kevin McCarty, the Commissioner of the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation.
Does the insurance industry have an unfair image problem, and if so, what can be done to?
It has an image problem. It has an image problem. Some of it is self-inflicted. Some of it, and much of it is not. And I'm just being very candid. Sometimes the industry could do a better job in communicating, and I think particularly the reinsurance industry. I mean, the reinsurance industry is in Florida trying to shrink the cat fund at the very time rates are still going up, and the reinsurance industry is largely viewed by the press and by the public as being inordinately greedy. Now, I have a fond appreciation for the reinsurance industry because it is the bedrock of gateway of capital for our state, and if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have a market in our state. But I can certainly see how those perceptions are, people have those perceptions. I think people feel about like insurance the way they do their congressmen. They think their insurance company is fine, but their insurance companies as a whole are greedy and not caring.
What are some of the weaknesses within the state regulatory system that you would point to?
It's like Groundhog Day. We keep looking at some of these issues over and over again. I mean, we keep trying to do more and more on the uniformity of producer licensing. Could it be more efficient if we had a central place to go? That's why last year we endorsed an ARAB 2 to look at a concept. And we went back and made sure all the consumer protection enhancements were in the bill. But it makes sense for us to have some more efficient way. It's not very productive in a current culture in modern society for us to have so many differences in the states, and how the cost associated with having a producer licensed and appointed in states and counties and with different rules and regulations.
What's Florida doing to try to improve the workers' comp situation?
We were very fortunate several years ago in 2003 to enact very significant sweeping changes to our workers' comp system that really focused on the returning to a self-executing system. And by that, we try to get the lawyers out of the system and get the doctors to see patients properly, get them quality medical care, and get them back to work. And I think we made great progress with regard to that. We saw over 60% rate reduction over those years. Unfortunately, the last 3 years, we've had rate increases of 7.8%, 8.9%, 6.1% over the last 3 years. So we're looking at the cost drivers in the system, and we don't want to wait until the system is so weighted down with problems that we have to do another wholesale solution. So what we're going to do is kind of try to look through the data, parse through the data, and find out where the cost drivers are. If you look at Florida and compare it to the rest of the nation, it has a disproportionate amount of its premium dollar, or its benefit dollars paid out in medical care. 68% versus about 60%. And then we look and parse through that data, we see that pharmaceuticals are high, hospital charges are high, and ambulatory surgical centers are high. And then say, okay, so what's going on in each of those systems, and how do they compare with the rest of the country, and what can we do about it? Well, drug repack is not a new issue in Florida. We've reported on this for a number of years. We've been out front on this issue. We think this is a significant problem, both in terms of cost of the system, but also quality of care to the injured worker. Florida has seen an explosion in the number of physicians prescribing dispensing drugs in their doctor's office, and also a disproportionate amount of the total drug dollars going out are being dispensed by physicians, which is totally contrary to what's going on in the rest of medical science, contrary to what's going on in trends in other states. New York and Texas have banned the physicians from it. And the reasons for that are many. I think, first of all, there is an inherent conflict of interest, but we also see the data shows that injured workers get more drugs when they get it from a physician and for longer duration. And having more drugs and longer duration, I don't think necessarily translate into better treatment protocols or early return to work. So, as a matter of fact, there is data out there to suggest the otherwise. But we're suggesting is that battle, is not going to be won in Florida, eliminating physicians from dispensing drugs. But I think a practical solution is making sure whatever you charge for whatever you get compensated for in the doctor's office is the same as you would get compensated if you bought it at a pharmacy. And what you're doing is you're taking the economic incentive out of it. You know, if you take the top 5 commonly prescribed drugs, and you looked at what's being paid for by a physician, it's 51% to 150+% higher getting it through a drug dispensed through a physician than if you bought it at the pharmacy. And some of the drugs that they're prescribing are things that are over the counter, which even exacerbates the problem.
And that reform is realistic, is likely to happen?
There's an awful lot of money pouring into Florida from stakeholders that have an interest in keeping the system, the status quo. But, you know, that doesn't keep me from swinging for the fences. I think, you know, I think it's the right thing to do by our injured workers. I think it's the right thing to do by the employers. And I think it's consistent with the best medical protocols that are out there. And also it makes common sense to me.
And you mentioned modeling. I mean, a lot of insurers are pointing to, you know, call it a failure of the models, call it they didn't perform as well as they could. Is there any sort of role for state insurance commissioners to get involved in the modeling question and what can be done to improve their output?
You know, they're models. They're not supposed to be perfect predictors of the future, and their models are evolutionary. They're ever changing, and you know what the models we've seen just a few years ago. They take you know, you go a stretch of time without any events. Then you have events like we had in 2004, 2005. It was terrible for the insurance industry, it was terrible for the people of Florida, but it was a bonanza of data for the modelers because you had several storms that came across with different wind speeds, for different durations, with different building codes, with different code enforcements. So it provided an enormous amount of data points for the modelers to take into and build into their models. And you would expect that. You would expect there to be changes. And in Florida, we've tried to address that in, I think, 2 very important ways. One, we have the Loss Methodology Commission, Loss Cost Methodology Commission, which really does an evaluation and sets standards and evaluates the major modelers for compliance with those standards. And they try to take advantage of best science and best scientific practices in evaluating those standards. And the second thing that I think is critically important that Florida has done is we've developed our own model. Through our state university systems, we've developed through Florida International University as the lead university, the Florida Hurricane Public Model, which brings transparency to the whole process. You know, one of the criticisms you heard in the past is, you know, many of these models at the time were owned by reinsurance brokers and then selling reinsurance to primary carriers based on those models, and you can understand where some of the people of Florida were a little suspicious. But what we find out is the Florida public model is probably if you array the data, is right in the pack with where the other ones are. Actually, and some would say is a little high compared to on average on some of the loss costs that are developed from using the models. But I think those are 2 important ways. And lastly, you know, I think we really ought to work collaboratively, collectively through the NAIC to look at different ways of models. We had a real huge change in one of our major models that changed pricing in Florida very dramatically. And it really posed the question of were you wrong the last 5 years? Because, you know, I paid a money for your services the last 5 years. And a lot of our domestic companies predicated their loss portfolio based upon a model that changed pretty dramatically in 1 year. And so I think that it's an appropriate place for us to look at what goes behind those models and the assumptions that go into it. We look at models as a critical tool for solvency as well. I mean, we use models to test various stress testing of companies. So models play a very important role, and they are just that. They're predictors. They're going to change, and as events occur, they use those data points to hopefully improve the model in the future.